Welcome to Voices of Dyslexia, sharing perspectives. In these videos, we will be speaking to individuals about dyslexia on the theme of Dyslexia Awareness Month, which is Dyslexia Rights. And we'll be talking about the right to assessment, the right to identity, and the right to supports. In this first video, we will be talking about the right to assessment. And I'm delighted to be joined by three individuals who will be having a discussion with us about how important assessment is in terms of dyslexia. We're joined by Ivanna, Ivanna McMahon, who is current Miss Ireland, and she is a voluntary ambassador for Dyslexia Association of Ireland. So we're delighted to have Ivanna join us tonight. We also have Keith Murphy, who's a lecturer at TU Dublin, a lecturer in applied social care. And Keith was actually assessed later in life, and that will be something we will talk about in this video. And finally, last but not least, Dylan Sweeney, who is a post-primary teacher with dyslexia. So we're delighted to have everyone join us this evening. And I suppose I maybe kick off first, Ivanna, just to maybe talk about, in your experience, could you share a little bit about becoming aware that you were dyslexic and the importance of that?
Absolutely. Thanks very much for the brilliant introduction. So I suppose I feel myself I was identified a little bit late as dyslexic. So I would have been 17, 18, so towards the end of secondary school. But I was aware of the fact when I was going to secondary school, especially, I remembered that there was something a little different in how I was learning or how I found things in the classroom in comparison to my peers. But I suppose I didn't speak to anybody about it, and no one really spoke to me about it. And I wasn't aware what dyslexia was. I hadn't heard anything about it. So I didn't really understand. And so for me, I felt that I just wasn't able to kind of keep up with my peers with my reading, or I used to be really embarrassed or really anxious about having to read out loud in class, and I couldn't understand how other people didn't have that same difficulty. And so for me then, actually having someone approach me, so it would have been in sixth year, one of my teachers came after I had a test, and one of my answers, I'd written the right answer, but wasn't confident with the spelling of the right answer. So I'd actually scribbled it out and rewritten the answer that wasn't exactly 100% right, but I knew I spelt it 100% right. And she saw through the typics or whatever that I typics out my answer that I had the original answer, but just not spelt right. So she said, "Are you dyslexic?" And I was a little offended because, as I say, I didn't understand what it meant to be dyslexic, and I had kind of misconceptions about kind of what dyslexia actually is. And I said, "No, I'm not dyslexic." But then I remember I came home and I spoke to my parents about it, and then I went and got assessed. And I think it's definitely one of the best things that I ever did, with regards having kind of more confidence now in myself with my schoolwork then after in college and my intelligence. So for me, I think it's so important that you have your assessment, and the right to the assessment is there, because it made a huge impact in my life, in my schooling after I had that identity of being dyslexic. And I wish I found out when I was younger, because it would have given me more time to kind of accept it. And I would have been able to, maybe had a little bit more supports. But I think at the end of the day, just getting that assessment is so, so important. And people being aware, so kind of keeping on the lookout for, if they feel, maybe if it's your own son or daughter, or if you're a teacher in school, kind of keeping it at the back of your mind that 10% of people are dyslexic. So there could very well be someone in this classroom or at home that is dyslexic. So to keep that there to go ahead and get an assessment if you do think that potentially a child is dyslexic.
That's great. Thanks, Ivana. I liked what you said, that line about I wish I found out when I was younger. Maybe bringing in Dylan here then.
Yeah,
Dylan, you did find out you were dyslexic younger, I think. Is that right?
yeah. I found out, so it would have been about senior infants, kind of first kind of class, first, second class. And it would have kind of came about initially through kind of my behavior, and kind of in the classroom, I kind of took my frustration out in my behavior within the classroom. And I think a lot of maybe students be able to identify with that. It just wasn't on my level, and I couldn't understand So because I couldn't understand, I think it was just initially, you know, as I reflect back now, I think I just thought, you know, I was just stupid or I was different. I was lucky then to get the opportunity that was actually a family friend, was actually training at the time, and actually did a test on me. And she came back and was like, well, like, I think he's dyslexic. So I went forth then, and then with my school as well, and actually got assessed then through the school, and we got in touch with the right people. And it was a chance for me to kind of understand myself. And at least when you know, then for moving forward for learning, I can kind of understand who I was. I got the opportunity then to I left my primary school and then attended actually a dyslexic primary school for 2 years. So I was surrounded by people with dyslexia. And I think that was a really core time in third and fourth class for me to develop skills, you know, life skills basically, and coping mechanisms really, in the positive sense. For them, when I did return back to my primary school for fifth and sixth class, I was actually a lot more able to deal with that kind of the mainstream kind of classroom, and kind of deal with kind of day to day, and kind of understand, and kind of I developed my identity, and I was proud of who I was at that stage. And I was very much kind of, I wasn't the only one who's ever dyslexic I ever met, you know. Any additional supports I might have received of, I wasn't ashamed of them. And it was just like, oh, this is just what I need to bring me up to level. So I was lucky in that sense. And yeah.
So it's almost like there wasn't a time where you weren't dyslexic.
Yeah, exactly. So it's and you know, I'm thinking back now, and I can only remember kind of little bits, to be honest, because I was that young at that age, you know, of kind of like, you know, 8, 9, 10 or so. So I'm just kind of reminding back to maybe how I kind of felt at that time. And I think it would have been kind of a time of, you know, kind of feeling frustrated. And I, you know, distinctively remember having there was an element in the class where I used to just wander around the class, and the teacher used to say hands, and I used to have to run over to my table and put my hands on the desk, you know. And it was even elements like that, because the work just wasn't, I just couldn't understand the work. And you know, it was just coming out in other ways. Yeah.
Great. Keith, you have probably a different experience from both Ivana and Dylan in terms of when you found out you were dyslexic.
Yeah, I found out I suppose quite late in life. I only found out in 2017. Uh, I had dyslexia, and I think I was studying for my PhD at the time, in the first year. But I suppose when I went to primary and secondary school, I don't think dyslexia was probably even in a conversation in Ireland. And I grew up with very negative preconceived ideas of what dyslexia was. And when I did end up, I actually left school because I just couldn't handle it. It was very similar behavior, and couldn't sit down easy, couldn't do the work. I actually loved learning, and I loved going to the school environment, but I just hated the way I was being taught. And it just, I couldn't learn. And obviously then I was bold, I was not trying, etc., etc. And even today, and we still see these things on the report cards. And it's something we need to be very mindful of when we see that on the child's report card. But I went to college then, and I studied with a friend of mine, and if it's okay to say, she actually at one stage worked for Dyslexia Ireland and recognised immediately that I had dyslexia. But again, dyslexia was a very negative thing. I kind of thought it was something that if you have dyslexia, you Google it, you know, you make that mistake and go to Uncle Google. And I Googled it. And again, like you said, it's a reading disability, it's a learning disability, you struggle with reading. So kind of I thought, well, I'm able to read, so I obviously haven't got that. But anyway, it was a huge struggle for me in college, with all the characteristics of it. And eventually I went and got tested. And when I was assessed, I mean, it was a fabulous moment, to be honest, because it was like coming out of a dark tunnel and someone turning on the light, because it made so much sense to me that like I wasn't stupid or thick or whatever else. I just actually done things differently. So for me, I just look on that I have a brain that operates different than other people's brains, and I do things my way, and that's how I look on it now, as opposed to being put in this box of, whatever is wrong or right, or stuff like that. And again, I'm not dissing anything, but I look at it like that, so as it enables me to move forward and learn. And I also try to say to people that that's how to look at it, rather than letting it kind of holding you back. Because It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means certain supports has to be put in place so you can do it, you know. So when I found out that I had dyslexia, it was a really good moment for me. You know, so actually the moment I found out, I changed PhDs. I'd already done a year of a PhD on a certain research topic, and the minute I found out, I said, right, I want to look at this much deeper. So I did a PhD on dyslexia, and I did find, and I had lots of participants in it, and I lecture in a university, so I could have anything from 140 to 250 students in the semester. And I noticed straight away nearly if somebody is struggling and if they don't have an assessment, and particularly the more mature student who mightn't have gone through a system and mightn't have got noticed, it's much more aware today than it was then. So you can pick it up and then help them and give them strategies. But I've noticed with a lot of the teenagers come straight from leaving certain that have dyslexia and were assessed very early, they're much more able to cope with it. They're much more accepting of it, and they achieve not that they achieve more, but they have an easier journey because they've put the strategies in place, they've had the supports, and they've been able to kind of implement that in their learning. And it always seems to me that it's easier for them, you know. So I think the right to assessment, I mean, is vital.
Thanks for that, Keith. Thanks for everybody. So I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but we hear a lot in the education literature about early assessment and early intervention. So spotting something and doing something about it. Keith, you touched there on, you're seeing people who maybe are aware of their difference in learning, coming in with quite a different attitude to those who maybe aren't aware. What do people think about that then? Is that a truth that we may be spotting stuff as early as possible is something we should be striving for and asking policymakers to ensure it happens?
Absolutely. I think I agree 100%, even when you said there, Keith, about the acceptance that people have now when they come in, if they have that early assessment. I think that's huge. Because I know myself, it did take me a few years to fully accept the fact that I was dyslexic and completely understand it. And I think if you do have that assessment when you're younger, when you're in primary school, like Dylan had, it gives you all that extra time in school to accept it, and to also have those extra supports. And like Keith mentioned, then you're going to be absolutely way more prepared when you do go to secondary school, and then equally college as well, where college, I think, is a lot more based on, you're not going to have a teacher there that's making you do your homework, or a teacher that's kind of quizzing you every day when you go to school. So there's a lot of more self-learning there. And if you have those initial skills or strategies built up from primary school, you have that skill set then when you go to college and you're, ready to learn to the best of your ability, which is great.
Yeah, like I think, even bring it back to the primary school, like personally, I was able to kind of learn them skills from age 10. So that's kind of, I was able to learn the way I learn, at such a young age, and become accepting and comfortable and confident in learning myself. And I enjoy the act of learning. And I think, Keith mentioned there as well, we just kind of learn differently. And I think being able to understand that you learn differently and, finding your kind of learning style and your method and what works for you is really key. And I see that in my job now, where I'd have fifth and sixth years as a post-primary teacher. And they'll just come and, these are a few months away from their leaving certs. And I'd say, sir, I still never actually studied. They're like, what does studying actually mean? And then I sit down with them and I tell them my story and I show them 5, 10 different ways of studying. And it's just for them to understand that everybody learns differently. There's different methods, and you just need to find the way that works for you, basically. And it's this whole idea nearly of the universal design of learning, of presuming that everybody is different and just taking that acceptance on board. But if the student knows that they are dyslexic, it can really just help them and guide them, and as early as possible, we'll support that.
Yeah, I agree, because I mean, even my own experience here in the house, where like one of my own daughters has dyslexia, and it was picked up even before I was assessed. And she was kind of in school and had, that one good teacher or that one good person, and that teacher noticed, but the funding and everything else. But the teacher spent the time and took her out, gave her the extra supports, and helped her with the strategies. And I look at her now, she's in secondary school, and I mean, she still has the struggles. It doesn't lessen the struggle, or it doesn't lessen the workload, but it just enables you, the early assessment enables you to get the strategies in, as Ivanna says, get them into place, get them working for you, and you learn then and you develop. And I suppose when you go to secondary, it's different. You need to redevelop that, and then when you go to university, it's the same. And I do think like it's not the educationer's problem. I think that in teaching colleges and that we need to pay more attention to it. As you said, Donald, like the dyslexia is kind of getting written out and they're changing terminology or whatever, where it actually is this one real thing that has this massive spectrum. There's no real, I find, awareness about it in terms of assessments or how we spot it in the classroom or the college room or the workplace, especially, you know. So I think early assessment is vital.
Yeah, I think with the early assessment as well, when you're speaking about teachers recognizing that, I was shocked, to be honest, and horrified really when I completed my PME 2 years masters. As part of that, there's one module on special education and one lecture for about 40 minutes, half an hour, was talking about dyslexia and other learning difficulties, and that was it. So I mean, that's a shocking kind of element of it as well, where teachers are starting off and they're not trained in that either. I know that's a kind of another discussion really to have as well, but it's that's the case, unfortunately.
And I agree, Dylan, it is probably another discussion than this one, but it's very important because even I found in the work I've been doing that when someone has an early intervention, or if they come into contact with a teacher or a lecturer, or maybe a manager and work, whatever, that has personal experience of dyslexia, either through a family member or a friend, or as an educator, someone they've dealt with before, the person with dyslexia's experience is much nicer and less challenging because that person has a bit of experience and makes it that little bit easier for the person with dyslexia to manage the challenges and the environment.
That's great. And it's certainly something that we have as a strong advocacy position. All teachers have access to the appropriate training at the appropriate time, but also in the appropriate depth. I think your point, Dylan, 45 minutes isn't really going to cut it. And when we've done surveys of our teachers every couple of years, it's quite stark when we say, when you started teaching, were you feeling confident and comfortable about teaching, supporting young people with dyslexia? Over 90% of teachers are saying, no, we didn't get enough during our initial training. Do you think if we got that bit right, then maybe the early assessment and the right to assessment would be doing a better job around that?
Definitely. Sorry.
No,
I
go ahead.
think if it gives the teachers the skills to even recognize it, it's just, I don't think there's one solution, and it's just a chain of things that will actually support. And I think the early recognition, and obviously if the education professional that's working with the child can spot that, that's an excellent opportunity for that to be identified.
Yeah, I agree 100% there. From doing school talks throughout the year, a lot of teachers that I would have spoken to have felt the exact same way, that they couldn't understand once they started teaching in practice how they got so little lecture time on what it meant to be dyslexic and what they could do to help someone that was dyslexic. So I definitely think having a little bit more kind of education for teachers, but even people in general, because I think if we have more awareness of dyslexia, what it actually means to the general public, that's going to also feed into teachers that are going into their teacher training as well. I think if we have more of awareness of what it is and what people can do in general, that will help.
Yeah, I also agree. I mean, it isn't a one fixed solution, but I do think if we do, like I did a teaching degree as well, and I'm not even sure, that was in 2014. I'm not even sure I remember it even being covered, and it was now the teaching degree was in adult education, where you're working in ETBs and universities, stuff like that, where in a more mature population, it's still massively undiagnosed. And like, as we said, or Ivanna said, I think there's 1 in 10. So if you have a classroom of 40, you've got 4 people out of that 40 that more than likely have it, probably more. You're sitting with a university of 100 students. Like, 10 people in the room have it. Like, that's a huge proportion of who's sitting in the room. And we don't know what to do. We don't know how to handle it. We don't know how to recognize it. And when we do recognize it, we don't then know how to support it. And I know, like, teachers are stressed and everything else, but the earlier we can do it, the easier the journey is later on in life, and then through adulthood, etc.
And can I ask, sometimes we hear a dialogue which says that people are nervous or hesitant about labeling or labeling children too early. What do people think about that? Because sometimes that leads to this wait and see, and you're almost all the way through primary school before anyone's doing anything about it. Any thoughts about this? Is labeling a good thing, a bad thing? Is there some nuance to that?
I think,
sorry,
Dylan. I think that labeling, maybe, I don't know, I have different ideas on labeling, but I think if, like, we spot, say, a child has a cold, we might give it a spoon of medicine or a tablet or whatever. So the minute we spot the cold, we intervene immediately. When we spot a child struggling in school, what do? Do we make an assumption of why the child is struggling in terms of intellect? Or do we say, okay, why is that child struggling? Let's have some sort of a small little tester kind of a thing that the child can do. And it might say, okay, that child has dyslexia or something else or whatever. And we say, right, the child has dyslexia, well, let's try A, B, C, D and see if them strategies work. So I'd argue with anybody till the cows come home that the earlier the intervention, the easier it is for the child going into secondary, going into adulthood, etc., etc. And children and adults even don't want to be different. They don't mind being different when they cope, but they don't want to be sitting in a room identifying as different with their mates or being taken out for the special classes and all. And I know that's essential as well, but it's just the earlier these are put in place, then the less chance that is of happening. Sorry, I'm
yeah.
very passionate about early intervention.
I think for the intervention and say the labeling, I think it can only nearly be a positive thing when it comes to dyslexia. That's not to say for other other labels and other things. I'm just speaking in a dyslexic perspective. It's only a positive in a sense of what Keith's saying, and to know then, okay, what can we do now to support you in other ways? And I think that's where the positive side would be, and how essential it is to be diagnosed early as possible with intervention.
Yeah, I agree that it would only be seen as a positive label. And I think if giving someone the label of being dyslexic at a young age gives them a better opportunity to, learn more as they're going through school, then it's never too soon to do that. I think you should get assessed as soon as there's kind of any query that they could potentially be dyslexic. And then, you can go from there to try and help someone, because it's not until you have that assessment and know that you are dyslexic that you can actually take the steps then to go ahead and try and help to help that child do better and see how they can, learn better. And so without that label, you can't really get to that place. So it is so important to have that assessment early.
That's great. And that segues nicely into our next video, which we will be covering how important it is to have that identity as a dyslexic person and that right to identity. So thanks, folks, for all your contributions in this video, where we've been talking about, I think, fairly convincing arguments about the right to assessment being absolutely vital and early assessment being key as part of that. So thank you very much.